Hey everybody, Jason Blaha here with Ice Cream Fitness. Hold on, let me give you guys a bicep shot before we get started. Okay, on to the topic at hand. Today's video is going to be a little bit controversial, and in my personal experience, I personally catch a lot of flack for the way that I do various rowing motions because I do not do anything that would even resemble a strict row, and yet I get complimented on both my back width and back thickness. And so it brings up the question of why do so many of the world's best bodybuilders and with the best back development, just historically, why are they always criticized for the way that they do rowing and the way that they train their back when they obviously get results? I mean, these are generally the guys who are the best backs in the world. And off the top of my head, I can only recall one Mr. Olympia who wasn't criticized for it, and that was Lee Haney. You go back and look, Arnold has been criticized for just the way he does extremely sloppy T-bar rows and barbell rows. He was heavily criticized for this. Dorian Yates, for doing his supinated Yates rows that are almost upright, and people were telling him that it's completely a trapezius movement and doesn't really work the lats. Yet he had this tremendous back. Um, Ronnie Coleman, Jay Cutler, they've both been extremely criticized for the same thing, and yet they had just amazing backs. Now the latter ones, the explanation is well, they just use tons of drugs, and so they'll grow no matter what they do. However, when you use the Arnold example, yeah, Arnold definitely used steroids, but if you go research what the cycles look like, there are 160-pound, 170-pound kids training at your gym who use more steroids than the pro bodybuilders did in Arnold's day. And they don't have huge, thick Arnold or Franco Columbu looking backs. So the problem becomes is that this anecdotal explanation doesn't seem to apply in the real world. So why would we suddenly go from that one style of training a muscle works when you're natural, and when you add drugs in, it no longer works, and using something that won't work automatically becomes the best. Now we can often say this for things like training frequency and volume, which makes sense, but to say that a muscle is more stimulated and grows better if it's trained incorrectly when you're on drugs doesn't make sense. I mean, if using the super strict form worked better, we would see more of the top bodybuilders in the world historically doing strict rows and achieving their amazing backs, but they don't, and that's the problem. Um, so let's try to look at why this is. And then again, they're criticized because they break from traditional form. They tend to use lots of cheating, leg drive, hip drive, or sometimes they go too upright near the top of the rep. I'll give you guys even an example of someone off the bodybuilding.com forum who's a very well respected. He's a natural bodybuilder and fitness model named Manu Graywall. He goes by the name P. Bateman 2. Holla back, Manu. And he's often, I've seen people criticize him because he does, extreme cheat rows, even as a natural bodybuilder, but he does like 450-pound rows, and he does 9-plate T-bar rows with excessive cheating, and even his dumbbell rows, he cheats on those more than most people cheat on their standing barbell rows. And yet he has just tremendous back development. I mean, just overall size, thickness. I mean, it's probably his best body part. And so again, you see another example there. I mean, and even with me, I'm personally criticized for this. And here, I started training again, last summer when I was given medical release to train again. And I mean, at that time, I was completely out of shape. I could barely bench press the bar. And these are my back pictures from exactly 1 year after I started training heavy again. Exactly 1 year. And these were for the Nutrition Mist Summer Transformation Challenge. And I'll show you these two pictures. Okay, and so for me, I mean, I have pretty good back development at that point. And yet I use horrific form. I mean, I'll show you guys how the form that I use to rebuild my back on barbell rows. back when I was still a fatty before I did my cut for the Transformation Challenge. And I mean, this was done, this was me back in May, and I mean, I was still building up the size before these pictures. And so take a look at this video. Notice in that I'm using a lot of leg drive. And so again, a lot of people call that a very sloppy row, and I was very criticized when I put that video up, uh, online, just showing how I row. And I mean, again, I was criticized, but yet people criticizing me, have inferior back development. So I mean, again, there's a problem. One of the things you'll notice with that row, though, is that a couple of things. One, you'll notice I take a fairly narrow grip, and I stretch really, really far down at the bottom. And then I pull explosively, and I use a little bit of hip drive, and then my back comes up, and I'm not as concerned about contraction at the top. I'm generally concerned within a controlled eccentric, and you'll notice when I lower it down, it's a very controlled eccentric, and I get a deep stretch at the bottom. And for me, I've personally always felt that when I train very heavy and I train with weights that are impossible for me to do strictly, and I cheat, but I get that deep stretch at the bottom, I feel a deeper burn and more stimulation in my back than I do doing strict rows or even chest supported rows or anything else. I mean, they're just uncomparable in terms of the pump and burn I get in my lower and outer lats. I mean, they're not even comparable. And the heavier I go and the more I cheat, the more it hurts and the more it burns in that whole region. So what does the science say on this? And the science doesn't really help us here, because when we look at EMG studies and things like that, we get conflicting information regarding, which rows and chin-ups and everything else and pull-ups produce the best stimulation in lats. I've seen conflicting studies on the different ones. I've seen some where the super strict pen lays produce good results. I've seen ones where the standard standing barbell row outperformed those. I've seen some where the T-bar rows are right there equal with the barbell row, and the T-bar row is actually one of my personal favorites for lat development. And I'm going to demonstrate that here at the end of this video. And so, I mean, again, it raises these questions of so how is this working for these bodybuilders? And I think there's something that needs to be seen there when we look closer at those EMG studies. And I saw some done by, I want to say it was Brett Contreras, who did some, and I found really interesting is that rack pulls, which are not considered by many to be even a traditional lat movement, performed amazingly well, and they might have been the actual top performer in latissimus dorsi stimulation on those studies. And yet all it is just, the top half of a deadlift, basically. So, with a very heavy weight. So again, when we look at that, it might explain why a lot of these, hybrid leg drive type rows produce just spectacular results in professional bodybuilders all throughout the decades and in the Mr. Olympias and things. And why doing them with heavy weights might do that, because in some ways it might be simulating the same action you're getting from the rack pull by cheating and using a heavier weight and then pulling up at the top a bit, because again, you almost always see back extension and hip drive and things involved. And so again, that might be the secret to the success. And I don't think on this, science isn't giving us a clear answer, because what people are claiming, based on the EMG studies, outside of when you look at something like the rack pull and making that association, doesn't match what we see in the real world. So we really need to study this better and get a better understanding. So I would say until then, you almost have to go off of feel for this. And this is where it gets tricky, because generally, when you start using these hip drives and leg drives, for anyone who's built up a proper foundation, it's not a problem. I mean, for me, even when I do T-bar rows, with 400 plus pounds, sloppy, I don't feel any problems in my posterior chain, my lower back, my hips. They feel worked a little bit, but I mean, they get a little bit of a pump, but I certainly don't feel anything that's a strain or a stress. Whereas, and if you take the novice who has a weak posterior chain because he hasn't trained it correctly and a weak core, they're going to be more prone to injury. So I say for the novice trainee, if you haven't built up a really strong posterior chain through squats, deadlifts, good mornings. I mean, if you can't do a good morning with 225 pounds all the way down, You might want to be really careful about messing with cheat rows or putting English on your cheat rows and leg drives. And so until then, I would say go ahead and stick with strict form. But after that, once you reach that intermediate phase and you've built up a strong posterior chain, then it's time to start experimenting and find what works for you. I'm going to show you what works for me here in a couple of videos for T-bar rows, which are pretty much the main row I do at the moment for my back because I find them to be extremely effective for me. I feel like I can use a heavier weight, the shorter range of motion, yet still allowing that deep stretch at the bottom. Really burns my lats easily as effectively, if not more so than any other movement I've done, but the narrow grip and the lack of outer pull on it bothers my bicep tendon, at least after having torn a bicep years ago. And like for me, I would say Pendlay rows, which, you know, some people are arguing is strict and ideal, actually hurt it the worst. So I do Pendlay rows for about 2 weeks straight. Oftentimes I have to quit curling and everything completely because my bicep gets so inflamed from the movement. And a lot of it has to do with just the wider grip of it, I think, and that style of rowing, it irritates it, and I'm not able to do that type of movement due to that previous injury. But T-bar rows, even with, you know, 405 pounds, don't bother me at all. So let me go ahead and I'll show you a clip of me doing T-bar rows with about 355, and yes, that's 355 because those are not 45-pound plates. Okay, a couple things you'll notice. I mean, to a lot of people, a lot of form Nazis, that's going to look horrific to them. Yet those same form Nazis, they don't have a back to go with mine. They don't have the development. So yet, I do it in this manner, completely injury-free. It actually bothers my bicep tendon even less than a strict Pendlay row does. And it doesn't seem to put any strain on my lower back and posterior chain, or some of those things that people are worried about, because I have built those up through so much other heavy lifting and strengthening of those. There's just not enough strain on them to really be a problem doing that. Even when I go heavier, you know, up to 405 for my 5-rep sets. You'll notice I do that. I notice I use quite a bit of leg drive, hip drive. I get a deep stretch at the bottom, controlled eccentric on the way down, then I explode up and I drive up with leg drive. And then I come up right a bit. I mean, I am up, you know, past 45 degrees at the top. Then I lower it down and repeat the process. And for me, that movement, doing it in that manner that I find is my personal groove that works for me, just burns my lats, and it's so bad that I can barely stand it. And I mean, the more weight I add, the more it burns. And when I go up to 405 and do that, after every single set, it hurts so bad just from the muscles cramping through my whole outer edge of my lats that I have to take 5 minutes between sets just to get the cramping to stop, and sometimes foam roll them. And it's not, you know, the smaller support muscles up the middle or thoracic erectors. It's just the whole lower half and outer edge of my latissimus dorsi. And so clearly it's being tremendously stimulated by this, or else it wouldn't be cramping in such a manner. And so again, I mean, it's just seems intuitive to me that it clearly works the way I'm doing that. Let me go ahead and show you another one. The other set I did yesterday, one of the other ones I filmed. Okay, you'll notice from that side shot that one thing I pay a lot of attention to when I go to set it up, you'll notice that from the side, I set my lower back and posterior chain just like I would on a deadlift. And there might be a little bit of thoracic rounding at the top in my upper back, but you'll notice that my lower back, I have a protective curve in my lumbar. And again, it's just like I would do on a squat or a deadlift or a good morning or any other movement like that. I set up that protective measure that I just instinctively do from all the other posterior chain work, that by doing that, even for me, 405 on a T-bar row doesn't really seem to put very much stress on my lower back, even, you know, compared to something like a deadlift or a good morning. And again, you'll see when I do a good morning video, I mean, I do work sets of 8 with 275 on a good morning, and I go all the way down. And for me, that's a bit of a lower back work. But doing these rows in that way, because I set my back up correctly, just isn't particularly stressful on my lower back. It doesn't hurt. It gets a mild pump, but I feel it mostly in my lats and to some extent my thoracic erectors and the traps and things. But yeah, you'll notice now that I set up my lower back, and I would say to anybody doing it, you're going to have to find your personal groove. You'll notice when you look at all of these different guys, whether it's Jay Cutler, Ronnie Coleman, pull up Arnold's old videos of him rowing, or even look up the way Manu, P. Bateman too, rows, you'll notice they all have their own individual style and a groove that they set, and that seems to work for them. And you've got to find your own individual groove that works on your rowing and find what works for you on that. And I will say that on that one, because of limb lengths and insertions and things, everyone's is going to be a little bit different on something like that. And I've seen various styles of doing it different ways produce, Mr. Olympias through the decades. So it doesn't seem to be one set way. And the one thing I will stress is, again, I think it's very important that you get the full range of motion at the bottom, because again, for me, I always feel any type of row, I feel it in my lats more in the bottom half of the movement than I do the top. And so again, if you're missing that stretch at the bottom, you're shortchanging yourself. And the other thing that I would look at very specifically is, again, setting your lower back. Because if you're going to be using, and you should be doing that even when you're doing strictly so that you get in the habit. But the main thing is you start, using a bit of English, putting a little English on it, using a little leg drive, you do want to make sure that you have that protective measure and that curve in your lumbar in order to keep from having any lower back rounding. Otherwise you're going to end up snapping some shit up, as the Hodgkins say it. And again, and the other thing is that's also why it becomes critical as a novice trainee that you put a lot of attention building up your lower back, building up your posterior chain, so that you can do some of these tremendously effective hypertrophy movements injury-free, things like heavy push presses, heavy cheat rows, some of the lifts that will put tremendous amounts of muscle in your upper body and build just huge amounts of explosive power like that. Some of these lifts require you to have a strong posterior chain in order to do them safely and correctly. And again, I know a lot of people are not going to like what I've had to say on back training in this video, and they're gonna think that I'm giving out haphazard advice. And again, people are free to think that, because I get in debates and arguments all the time. But I mean, generally speaking, on this one, I've got to go with the anecdote due to lack of science, explaining what we see, and just point out that historically, I mean, and just in my personal experience, in observing people in gyms and, observing champions over the decades, the people with the best backs generally do not row strictly. And they have their own individual groove and method that they use. And so again, everyone has to find that right method to do proper cheat rowing that works for them. Then hopefully I've given you a few pointers on how to determine it for yourself. But again, with something like this, because most of the evidence for it is overall anecdote and a lot of it seems to be intuitive, you're going to have to just do what feels right on it. And again, hopefully I've given you enough pointers to guide you in the direction. And let me give you guys another bicep shot. And I'll talk to you next time.